it's just so nice to be in community with everyone here for a lot of reasons. The campus that you're in, it plays a really incredible role. And I know that the work you do with students, students of color, Filipino American students, is incredibly crucial. And I feel like I'm in a lot of ways a manifestation of that. I was telling Raul and Claire before we jumped on the official Zoom here that my entree into becoming a professor, a sociologist, a writer, some sort of speaker with respect to Filipino American issues was very much a byproduct of meeting a mentor by the name of Don Mabalan, Dr. Don Mabalan, who sadly passed away a few years ago. But Don Mabalan herself was very, very open about the fact that community college is where she got her start. Before she was at UCLA and did the master's program, bachelor's and master's there, and then did her PhD at Stanford. She was a community college student. And it was there that she was able to really develop the intellectual foundation to do the kind of work that has been transformative. Is an understatement of the year, because if you meet any Filipino that's in academia, every single one of them will have some sort of direct interaction or relationship with Don, if not secondary relationship with Don, that's really shaped why they became an educator. And so I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge the community college, but acknowledge the late Don, Dr. Don Mabalan in the process, because I feel like every time I give a talk, she's always in this space. So just to give you a little snippet of my story with her and how it relates to the work I do. I was, I'm from Los Angeles. I'm from Northeast LA specifically, and I grew up in a neighborhood that was, 20% Filipino. Some of you might be familiar with. It's Eagle Rock, which is kind of like a very Daly City, Vallejo type place. But I grew up around a lot of Filipinos there, and then I was in college. I went from there to Stanford for undergrad, where I couldn't find a Filipino for the life of me. Maybe there was like 20 Filipinos in the entire campus. And so it was, I say that because, going from an immigrant family, an immigrant neighborhood, to a place where folks were very unfamiliar, not just with Filipinos, but just like immigrant culture in general, or communities of color in general, it made things very hard. And so it was actually, in spaces like this, where we're able to talk and center the experiences of BIPOC folks. And it was through a freshman seminar that I took with Dawn when she was a PhD student at Stanford. I was on the verge of leaving college, and I was wanting to transfer somewhere else just to get the heck away from Stanford. But it was actually in Dawn's class that I took in the spring term of my freshman year when I was 18 years old that really, really helped me realize that Filipino American history and Filipino American issues and Filipino American experiences, all of those things count as knowledge. Because I think before that, I always just thought Filipino Americanness was just something that it was something that was at home, but I never, until that class, really understood that who we are as a community and the history that we bring to this country are so important for helping us understand broader issues of colonialism and imperialism and race and racism and sexism and homophobia. There's just so much that Filipino American experiences can teach the world. And so I hope that in today's very short conversation, I have a chance to just reinforce the idea that even though it's a group that is generally not talked about in your K-12 curriculum, with the exception of places like San Francisco or, Delano maybe, but there's still so much that we can learn from the Filipino American experience that informs everybody's experience beyond just our community. So I hope folks don't mind. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see just the slide deck. Cool. So
recording in progress.
Oh, was that me? Oh, sorry. Thanks for giving me the thumbs up that the screen's ready. So as some folks may know, I wrote a book called The Latinos of Asia: How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race. It was published in 2016. And I'm just, for any writer, you're just really surprised when people read your books. So the fact that like 6 years later, I still get invitations like this to talk about the book. It just really means a lot. And it means a lot, especially because for maybe the 10, 20 years before the book was published, I grappled with whether Filipino American stories were worth writing. And that wasn't necessarily a knock against, my sense of pride or anything. But if you think about it, everything about our K-12 experiences, the type of classes we learn in college, the things you choose to major in when you go to college, let me put it this way. If it, like, think about the number of times that Filipinos or Filipino readings or Filipino topics get discussed, it's probably pretty like slim to none. And that tells you, right, the content that you learn in a classroom space is an indication of how much institutions value those stories. And so for me, this book really started in that first class that I took with Dawn in the spring of 2000, 22 years ago. I still remember it. I was one of 12 students. I was one of the only freshmen in the class, and it was incredible. Because Dawn was she didn't play, so I remember the first day of class. She said, here is your reading for the class, and I kid you not, it was like two of these books like stacked. There was this big, and the reading was just, there was so much reading. And she did that because she wanted to literally drill home the message that we're going to be studying, researching, writing about Filipinos. This is not something that you should not take seriously. This is something you should take very seriously. And the other thing that she said on that very first day of class that I remember, it was this. She's like, if you learn nothing else from this class, go get your PhD, because we need more Filipinos to get their PhDs. And I often joke that, like, as an 18-year-old Filipino from a immigrant family, I didn't even know what a PhD was. I didn't even know what a professor, like, I had literally no idea like what that entailed. But that was the day that I decided I was going to get a PhD. And so I mentioned this because throughout college, I ended up taking a lot of classes where, whether it was in psychology or literature and history, sociology. One of the things I always wanted to do, because we don't necessarily read about Filipino experiences in our classes, I always did my best to try to learn the material as it relates to the Filipino American experience. And I feel very lucky that as someone that majored in ethnic studies in college, I had professors that gave me the leeway to pursue assignments and research projects that would be self-designed, where I got to explore everything from Filipino American literature to Filipino American psychology, Filipino American sociology. And I feel like in a lot of ways, those random musings that I had in my college career were very much the seeds of writing this book. And I feel very lucky that when this book was published in 2016, I have the opportunity to meet folks like yourselves here. But I've been really blessed in that I've gotten letters and emails from everyone from high school students to senior citizens telling me things like, this is the first time I got to read about my experience in an actual like printed page, which means a lot. And also what really I think is my favorite thing is when I get notes from high school students that say, oh, I'm writing my senior project is about your book, or I'm doing a documentary based on your book. One time I met a choreographer that said, I'm choreographing a dance that's inspired by your book. And I just thought, like, if something as simple as a book, which is just another way to say storytelling, if me writing a book and telling these stories has been the catalyst for other people to render the Filipino American experience in other forms, then I think like it really underscores how important it is for us to tell our stories, whether it's in one-on-one conversations, whether it's at a work meeting, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's just in the context of a family. Stories play a really big role. And for me, as a college freshman that felt like I wanted to leave college, it was stories that actually kept me there. It was stories that helped me develop my intellectual confidence, my academic confidence, and at the end of the day, my sense of belonging, that I felt like I belonged on campus. And so I'm sorry that's like a super long-winded intro, but I wanted to share that very personal origin of this book because I do see it as very much I do see me and my writing as part of a longer genealogy of the kind of revolutionary work that folks like at your campus are doing to amplify Filipino American stories and sense of belonging, not just on campus but in this country. So um the thing about Filipino Americans that I really wanted to talk about was I just wanted to get Filipinos on the map. It's often surprising to people that there are 4 million Filipino Americans in the United States. It's surprising to people that Filipinos are the second largest Asian American group in the United States, although it might be third depending on what census data you're looking at, but pretty much up there. But despite the fact that Filipinos are such a large group, and in fact, on your campus, from what I hear, it's the largest Asian American group on campus in the state of California. Filipinos are often the predominant group in a lot of communities. What I realized in going to a predominantly white institution and traveling around the country is that Filipinos are very much a forgotten Asian American group. This is not my term. A community historian by the name of Fred Cordova, who's actually Don Mabalan's like uncle, he talks about Filipinos being this forgotten Asian American group. And I mentioned this because there's a huge irony to this. Filipinos, for a lot of folks don't know that the term Asian American was a term that came about in the 1960s during the civil rights movement. So at the same time that Black folks were fighting for civil rights, in Birmingham and in Greensboro, North Carolina, there was also this movement very much inspired by Black civil rights leaders happening in Chicano communities and, of course, Asian American communities. This was a time when Filipinos, alongside with Chinese and Japanese Americans, coalesced and said, hey, our numbers are kind of small. Let's get together and let's advocate for civil rights that were being denied at this time. And so this was the birth of the Asian American movement. The political movement is the birth of Asian American identity. It's, in a lot of ways I joke that like Filipino Asian American identity is kind of only like half a century old, because before the 1960s, most of these groups kind of saw themselves as separate. If you're Filipino, that's one thing. If you're Chinese or one thing. If you're Japanese, that's a different thing. And in fact, if you think about like the history of World War II, there were a lot of moments when Filipinos would almost proactively say like, oh, I'm not Japanese, or as a way to like demarcate themselves. So it was a really big deal that like Filipinos, Chinese, and Japanese folks came together to form the Asian American community. But here's the thing about these identities is that even though it may have these important political origins, the fact of the matter is that the meanings of these categories can change. So, in the 1960s, to be Asian American might mean to be an activist, but in the year 2022, if you were to ask the average person, what's an Asian American? Oftentimes, particularly outside the Asian American community, you'll often hear folks revert to stereotypes, either Asian Americans are the forever foreigners, or Asian Americans are the model minority. And if they happen to mention an ethnic group, they'll almost always mention groups that are of East Asian origin. Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, and Filipino Americans, along with other, Asian American groups like South Asians. There's some folks that are forgotten Asian Americans. And so for me, I was seeing this in real life. If folks can remember MySpace, from a long time ago, when we first had MySpace, I remember on MySpace profiles, I would see like Filipinos that I knew on their profile, when they had to pick their ethnicity, they would put mixed or other. And I knew for a fact that they weren't other, or they definitely weren't mixed, because I knew both of their parents, right? I also noticed like there were settings where in different arenas where Filipinos, they would say these like off the cuff remarks. So for example, if you asked a Filipino like, oh, who are the people that go to your school? They'll say like, oh, there's Black students, Mexican students, Filipino students, and Asian students, as if Filipinos were like a separate category. So I became really, really interested in this question, which is, are Filipino Americans really Asian? And in a lot of ways, it's kind of a silly question, right? Like, who cares? It's just identity. But the thing is, when you study sociology and when you study American history, the ways in which groups belong or don't belong to certain groups, it has real life implications for their lives, not just like identity. It also affects them in terms of how teachers treat them, the type of job opportunities they have, the type of neighborhoods they can live in, whether they're you can support them as political candidates, right? So the question of, are Filipino Americans really Asian? It may seem like a silly question, but what I'm really trying to get here is, how do we understand whether groups have a sense of belonging with larger communities of color? I opened the book with this silly story of when I was in UCLA and I was getting my PhD there. For anyone that's gone to grad school, you know that you don't make a lot of money. I have this, my friend has this picture of me that she posted on her Facebook account where I was in my like second to last or last year of grad school, where we're in Westwood, California, and we're at the Wells Fargo ATM, and we're trying to go to El Pollo Loco. And so I'm like, I need to pull out cash. So I go to the ATM, I try to pull out cash, but in my savings account, I have $0. In my checking account, I have -$2. And so that's just a funny story I share because at the end of the day, I was pretty broke as a graduate student, and I promise this story has a point. The reason I mentioned that is because right when I was at my lowest financially and morale wise in grad school, I happened to come across this flyer at UCLA, and it said alcohol study. Do you drink alcohol regularly? Are you Asian American? And if you participate in the study, you will earn up to $215. For any of you that's participated in like a psychology study, you know that generally speaking, you make like maybe $5, $10, maybe you'll get like a little gift card. So the idea that I was gonna get $215 was kind of a big deal. And so I called up the study coordinator. I said, hey, I'm Asian American. I have a few drinks here and there. So I was wondering, could I sign up for this study? And everything was going great until I mentioned that I was Filipino. That's when everything went downhill. She said, I'm sorry, we can't have you be part of the study because we can only have Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans as part of the study. And I asked why, and then she said, it's because we need a genetically similar sample. And so here I was, this sociology student that's learning that race is a social construct, not a genetic construct. And here I was in the situation where I knew for a fact that this researcher in the medical school, I believe it's the medical school, was going to develop medicine for Asian Americans and was actively excluding one of the biggest Asian American groups out there. And I just thought, wow, this is an example of how, something as silly as not feeling like you belong to a certain category can have real implications beyond just identity. So this is what I ended up pursuing. I really wanted to get the question of like, what are the moments when Filipinos feel like they're Asian, and what are the moments when they feel not Asian? And if they feel like they're not Asian, do they feel some other sort of connections, cultural connections with other groups? I did all sorts of things. I interviewed folks, I looked at surveys, and what I found is that when it came to Asian American identity, you ask the question, what is your racial background? Other Asian groups, Chinese, Vietnamese, Koreans, 95% of them, 95 folks out of 100, they pick Asian as their race. They pick Asian as their racial background. But when it came to Filipinos, it was pretty eye-opening that less than half of Filipinos chose Asian. And so I just really wanted to understand, why is it the case that Filipinos feel this sort of distance from Asian Americans? As a researcher, it's a funny thing when you ask questions, because a lot of folks that do research are not often thinking about Filipinos or people of color, right? And plus, there's not a lot of examples of studies that they might ask you, what is your racial background, but they're not going to ask the question like, what identity do you not, how do I phrase this? They don't ask you about what identity you don't have, right? It's kind of like a weird question. But one thing I noticed among Filipinos growing up is that there are a lot of Filipinos who actually felt like they would actively assert the fact that, like, oh, we're different from other Asians, we're not really Asian. And when I got to talking to a lot of the Filipinos that I interviewed, what I learned, and something that I was privy to because I'm Filipino myself, was that for a lot of Filipino Americans, even the ones that were born in the United States and had never spent time in the Philippines, what was really interesting to me was that a lot of Filipino Americans I interviewed would invoke colonialism as something that played a role in their identity. For most folks that aren't from colonized societies, they might be like flabbergasted. They're like, are you sure? Like colonialism, something in the past? Like, how are folks gonna know about it? But the reality is there's from a very young age, Filipinos were very aware that they came from a country that had colonial roots. Colonialism by the Spanish and colonialism by the Americans. So sometimes I would ask folks this question of like, why, like, do you feel how, like, what group do you feel closest to, or do you feel like you fit in or belong with Asian Americans? And some people would say yes, but a lot of people, like a very significant number of folks would say, actually, when it comes down to it, if I had to pick between which group I think Filipinos feel closest to, I feel like Filipinos are very close to like Mexicans or Hispanics or Latinos, right? There was this one young woman that I interviewed in the Leah. Her name is in the book. Her name is Leah. She's from Carson, California, which is like a Filipino, Latino, and Black city in Southern California. And when I asked Leah, like, which group do you feel Filipinos are closest to, she said, Latinos. And she elaborated. She said, well, it's kind of hard to think of Filipinos as Asians because we were colonized, we were colonized by Spain for over 300 years. In that way, like culturally, we're like more like Latinos. And something she said is something that I've heard time and time again from the people that I interviewed. And whenever I go places, I often hear folks say something that sounds something like this: Filipinos are the Mexicans of Asia. For folks in the room, how many of you, just feel free to chime in the chat or raise your hand. How many of you have ever heard something akin to this? Like Filipinos are like the Latin Asians or the Mexicans of Asia or the Hispanic Asians. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. For the Filipinos in the room, how many of you have ever had the experience of people assuming that you're Latina or Latino? Right? So my Spanish is way better than my Tagalog as well, Melissa. So you're not alone. Yes. So I wanted to really shine a light on this when I was first starting to do research, because as you know, for folks that are less knowledgeable about the different Asian American groups, there's a lot of folks who just assume that Filipinos are just Asian, right? But in reality, on the ground, there were a lot of moments when Filipinos are actually, they either don't feel like they're Asian or they're made to feel like they're not Asian. And a big reason has to do with the fact that there's these colonial legacies at play. I put that William Faulkner quote at the top because it just really resonated with this, which is, the past is not dead, it's not even past. And it's this, it really makes me think of Filipinos, because for a lot of those of us in the community, even though colonialism is something we think of as in the history, in the past, the reality is this 300 years of Spanish colonialism and 50 years of US colonialism, it's had a very huge influence on the modern day culture of not just the Philippines, but Filipino American communities throughout the diaspora. So what happens is that you're in a city like Los Angeles, which is also a very Latino city. What ends up happening is that if you have Filipinos who as an ethnic group have Spanish last names, are predominantly Catholic, or as perceived to be Catholic, are phenotypically darker, like a lot of people say a lot of Filipinos are like darker skinned than other Asians. They'll see these sort of the type of narratives that will come out when you talk to people. What that means is that there's a lot of Filipinos out there who very much, when it comes to their experience like on the street, or in everyday life will have experiences that are very much akin to Mexican American experiences or other Latino experiences. A little silly thing that happened just in the past month is that my department chair, who's actually South Asian, she's Indian, we're good friends. She's known me for the entire time I've worked at Cal Poly. She's known my partner Joe ever since we got together 9 years ago. And just last month, she said something where I realized she had no idea that my partner Joe, who's Filipino like me, she had no idea that he was Filipino. She said something, oh, Joe, because he's Mexican, da 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 da. And so here I was thinking, oh my gosh, for the past 9 years, you thought my partner is Mexican American. Because of his last name or the way he looks. And I thought that's something that needs to get talked about in research. There's this famous actor, which I think some of you may recognize. This is from the movie La Bamba, which is a biopic about Richie Valens, a Mexican American singer from Southern California, who sadly passed away, but sang a very, very, very popular song called La Bamba. And for folks in the chat, just who this is, could you type it in there? Who's this actor playing Richie Valens? Or unmute. Feel free to unmute. Okay, there we go. Julia, thank you. Melissa. Lou Diamond Phillips, right? Lou Diamond Phillips. I want to use him as an example because he's Filipino American. But when it comes to the way this country sees him, and in particular Hollywood, the way Hollywood has seen him, they've always seen him as a Latino person. He often plays Latino roles. His breakthrough roles were actually playing Mexican Americans. And I think that it's no accident that someone who's of Filipino descent had the sensibilities or the cultural familiarity to be able to play someone who's Mexican American. This is not a situation like where like a white person is cosplaying as a person of color, or like in like yellowface or blackface. This is one where it's like, oh, it's somewhat believable. Yeah, Julia, a lot of people, oh, Julia, you didn't know that he was a Filipino descent. Yes, this is a very common experience where people are like, oh my gosh, Lou Diamond Phillips is Filipino. But that's the thing. I think that really drills home the point, is that when it comes to Filipinos and the way they navigate this society, that's what's newsworthy about Filipinos, is how unnewsworthy they are when they enter Latino spaces, right? I had a student who's Mexican American who really said it best when she said, I'm Mexican, and whenever I invite my friends over to my house, it's interesting because if I invite my Filipino friends, I'll tell my mom, oh, mom, this is my friend Jennifer. But when I invite my Asian friends, is how she said it. When I invite my Asian friends, I'll always say, Mom, this is my Chinese friend, Alice. And this idea that you have to like demarcate, that you don't demarcate Jennifer, it really indicates that there's a sense of like cultural closeness that she felt with Filipinos. I think that we all know that when it comes to the language, I would interview folks and they would say things like, well, I think of Asians, I always think when it comes to language, they have like characters. But when it comes to Filipinos, what's interesting is that a lot of our words in Tagalog are pretty much exactly the same or very similar to the words in Spanish. So like the word for table, it's mesa, the word for fork and spoon, tenedor, cuchara, days of the week, lunes, martes, miércoles, jueves, viernes. The only different day is Sunday. In Spanish, it's domingo. In Pino, it's lingo. Clothing items, I'm wearing a camiseta. On my legs, pantalones, or in Filipino, it's pantalon. And then, everyday activities, trabajo. So I just want to say that like Tagalog and Spanish are very different languages. But here's the thing, when you live in a city like Los Angeles, or you live in a city like San Jose, or you live in a city in the Central Valley like Delano or Vallejo even, here's the thing, if you're a Filipino person and you overhear someone who's like a Mexican immigrant and they use certain words that sound like the words that your family uses, or vice versa, a Mexican or Latino person hears someone speaking Tagalog and then they use certain words that are, they know from Spanish, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, like, how is it that we have the same words? That becomes the catalyst for you to realize, oh shoot, Filipinos and Latinos have this really strong shared history because of colonialism. You could think of like last names as being part of why Filipinos feel some sort of kinship with Latinos and vice versa. It's often the case that when I interviewed Filipinos, they say things like, oh, I have a lot of Latino classmates in my college or in my workplace or in my neighborhood or my elementary school. We have the same last names. And here's the thing. When you have someone who has the same last name, what does your brain automatically do? You assume that they're related or family. So in some ways, last names also play a role in why there's this sense of kinship between Filipino and Latino groups. And of course, we can't deny this one. So even for the Filipinos that I spoke with that were not Catholic, they acknowledge that when it comes to ethnicity and religion, when it came to Filipinos, Filipino-ness and Catholicism were very much interlinked. And same thing for Latino groups. So one of the young women that I interviewed, when I asked her, what group do you feel closest to? She said, well, definitely Latinos. There's a lot of that strict Catholicism stuff. My parents and grandparents were very into having saints and the Virgin Mary in our house, and that's just like Latinos. There's a lot of culture and religion intermingled. And so I say this because not only are the symbols, like the cultural symbols or the imagery of religion in both Filipino and Latino households very similar, the reality is religion very much organizes immigrant community life. For a lot of Filipinos and Latinos, it's the church where you meet a lot of other folks from the same home country as you. And so, of course, like religion was often a story that Filipino Americans that I met would talk about. So I mention all of these things because it really underscores how important culture is when it comes to seeing whether groups feel like they feel a sense of togetherness or belonging. And what was playing out in the interviews and the conversations I had, I thought it was really interesting because in Los Angeles, Filipinos, the ones I interviewed were very much from more middle-class backgrounds. But what was interesting is that a lot of the Latinos that they were finding commonality with were folks from a different socioeconomic background. So you see how important culture is. And you see how in a lot of ways, the connections that modern day Filipinos were having because of these cultural similarities, it's a little bit different than the connections between, say, like Filipino farm workers and Mexican American farm workers, which was a connection that was because of shared labor market position or because of like poor working conditions that they both experienced in the agricultural sector, right? That was what it was. Labor, it was class that brought them together. But for a lot of the folks that I interviewed, it was the fact of the matter is they were of a different socioeconomic class, and it was culture that brought them together. So anyway, in that book, I what I wanted to do was really not just talk about Filipino Latino connections, but I also, of course, wanted to talk about moments when Filipinos felt some sense of solidarity with other Asian groups. And what ended up happening in the first book, is that I learned that, when it came to family life, when it came to religion, when it came to culture, when it came to immigration experiences, there was a lot of Filipinos would often kind of think of themselves as similar or more akin, like in proximity with Latino groups. What's funny though is when I asked them, oh, what are the moments when you feel a sense of solidarity with other Asians? Almost always the frame that they talked about, if not food, it was education. So this is all to say race is complicated, and especially for a group like Filipinos. And what was often the case when I interviewed folks is that there was a lot of stress when it came to having to figure out where Filipinos fit, what box to check. I can't tell you how many times in doing the research for this book and then giving talks in different parts of the country where Filipinos will talk about being young children and feeling very stressed out about that question when they have to fill out a form for like college or taking a test. or getting a driver's license or registering a vote, they'll be like, oh crap, like I'm Filipino, what box do I check? Because sometimes like there's a question that says Hispanic, yes or no, and it says Hispanic means, from a Latin American society or influenced by Spanish culture. And I'm like, well, how can I say that Philippines is not influenced by Spanish culture? But then they also know, well, I know that they're not trying to, like, they're asking this, but it's not like they're trying to loop us into this question. So it gets very confusing for a lot of Filipinos. Because Filipino American History Month also coincides with Latino Heritage Month. I've seen so many different names, like Latinx Heritage Month, but also National Coming Out. I did want to at least mention that a little bit of my first book, my second book, Brown and Gay in LA, The Lives of Immigrant Sons, which came out about a month ago. But one of the things I learned from doing the research for the first book was that so many stories about immigration that we hear on the news, in our classes, on TV shows, when we're thinking about communities of color or immigrant communities, I realized, and even when I was doing this research, that we're not often thinking about the LGBTQ members of those communities. If anything, maybe there's like one who's like on the sidelines or like a supporting character. But I really felt, especially as someone that identifies as queer, there really needs to be a whole book about the experiences of folks who are from immigrant families and from immigrant communities, but they also happen to be queer. And so for the second book, what was really interesting is that I didn't expect this, but what I learned is that for this book, I interviewed Filipinos and Mexican American queer young men. I realized that the how much of that source of kinship for queer folks in particular was also driven by the fact that when you grow up in a Catholic household or a Catholic community, to be gay is a very challenging experience, to say the least. And so what was interesting was the way I was able to observe that even for queer Filipinos and queer Mexican Americans, there were similarities there, but it wasn't often based off not just culture, but also their survival strategies for how they dealt with being gay, particularly those that grew up in the 80s and 90s when being gay was equated with the AIDS crisis. And so what I learned is that the way that these young queer men told stories was very, very similar as well. So with Franklin Flores, he kind of embodied what a lot of queer children of immigrants feel, which is this idea that to be the first generation of kids born in the United States, we are living proof of what that sacrifice meant. If you hear some weird sounds, it's my dog that's he has like sipon, like he has a cold or something. He's like making sounds, so don't worry about him. But yes, this idea we're living proof of what that sacrifice meant. That was a big part of, he said, this is a big part of why I went to college. That was a big part of why I didn't want to come out. Those were the ideas that would go through my head ever since I was in middle school. And very similarly, Mexican Americans that I interviewed would say things like, I was 10 years old and I thought I needed to get good grades so I can find a way to support myself. I wanted to get out of my house. My brothers would call me the F word. My big focus became school as a form of survival because I didn't like the environment I was in. So if you compare their narratives, you see that like inherent in both Franklin and Armando's stories, this idea that if you're gay, you have to sort of like make up for it by doing well in school or being like twice as good because you're gonna quote unquote, as one person put it, lose points for being gay. So I thought, wow, there's so, even when it came to different segments of these communities, you see that the similarities, they keep emerging and you really get to see those similarities between particularly queer sons of immigrants who are dealing with homophobia in all different aspects of their lives, from their family to their schools to the workplace to their neighborhood, and both are dealing with racism within the broader gay community. So I wanted to just wrap up by saying that people often ask me, like, when you did this research, what's one thing you learned? And if there's something that I learned, as someone that does this kind of work in academia, it can feel very, very lonely. What I learned is that in the process of doing research for this book, every time I interviewed someone, whether it was for the first book or the second book, what was really transformative was that with every person I interviewed, I realized, wow, I felt like more a greater sense of connectedness. And I felt like I was part of something much larger than myself, not just in the present moment, but I felt like I was part of something, a larger history that went beyond myself. And so I wanted to end there and just, with a little bit of a message of reminding folks that if you're Filipino or you're queer, you're any sort of minoritized population, your ability to tell your story and your ability to gather stories, it can really, really have a huge impact, not just in terms of like filling the gaps in those knowledge, but I think for like the self-esteem and the sense of self-worth and sense of belonging that often doesn't come with being, a student of color or the first person to go to college in your family, or being part of any group that's in a minoritized population. So yeah, I just wanted to pause there. I know we're gonna have a much broader convo during Q&A, but yeah, thank you for giving me the space to talk about this. And while we're gathering our questions, I'm just gonna grab my charger because I realize I'm not plugged in and I don't want to disappear. So just give me 2 seconds and I'll be here for Q&A.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo. A round of applause. I know you're using emojis and are there with us here on the screen. Please feel free to provide any comments or questions in the chat and or unmute. Be great to have some conversation discussion with Professor Anthony. There's his doggo right there in the picture. But as you're thinking about some of the
I'm here.
points that were shared, what are some reactions or thoughts? Thank you, Dr. Hong. Winnie Hong commented there. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Any
Yes,
questions
please feel
or
free to
comments?
unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah, just unmute, and if we haven't met yet, I'd love if you introduced yourself as well.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for.
Hi. And wonderful. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I'm the college nurse on campus with Filipinos and nurses. That's me. But yes, just because I was born here, but this is I haven't been able to attend because I've been off, but it's wonderful. I'm gonna have to come back and listen to all the other ones too, but this was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for what you do, because I mean, my mom's a nurse, so a lot of my aunts are nurses as well. So it's particularly nowadays, it's been I'm really happy that this country is really noticing the impact of nurses on a very, very, very deep level, because as you know, I'm sure you know, as a nurse, like it's in a lot of ways you're like the forgotten labor, and the reality is for patients, it's often the nurses that are the ones that matter most when it comes to their like health experiences in hospitals and such. So thank you as well. Oh, Julia, did your parents consider your family to be more culturally Latino or Asian? What did they foster in you and your siblings? So this is a good question. I think like there's differences, I think, in the way that immigrants and their US born children of immigrants feel. What I knew across the board is that when it comes to the immigrant generation, they generally see themselves as Asian, in part because they grew up in a country where the word Latino doesn't really exist in the same way that it does for like here in the United States.
Mhm.
And so they, for the most part, like parents, including my parents, would probably see themselves more as Asian. But what ends up being interesting, right, is like it's one thing to say those words. It's another thing to see what happens in real life. And what I would notice when I was growing up was that when it came to the coworkers or the friends that my mom would make that were not Filipino, for the most part, the friends she made as a nurse or like with other parents at the school, it was actually more common for her to befriend the Mexican or the Latino nurses than it was, say, like the Korean nurses or the other Asian nurses. And who's to say why that was the case? It's not like my mom was, my mom, it's funny because when I told my mom I was pursuing sociology, she was like, "Oh my God, I hated that subject because it was so boring." But like in a lot of ways, my mom was the first sociologist I met because she kind of did things that really showcased her understanding of how like her sociological lens of the world. A lot of them would be brought together by talking about, oh, we have like 50 million relatives live in our house too, or like, oh, another relative is staying there that just came from Mexico or the Philippines. Oh, I totally like we can commiserate about that. And of course, like, food items and such as well. So I think like even though I would assume my parents would feel they would say more Asian, they would also do things that even without saying it outright were kind of showcasing their connections or sense of connection with Latinos. What they foster in me, they we had a strong sense of Filipino identity, but I don't know if they thought in the broader categories. I'm an only child, so I have no siblings. But yeah, I also do think too that here's the funny thing. I think it also can be shaped by like what you look like as well and how. So like for example, like I have cousins with the same exact biography, but they like phenotypically look more East Asian than I do, and so I think for them that actually ends up being a factor for why they connect more with other Asian groups than say myself or my partner. More questions. All right.
Thank you.
So, yeah, of course. Melissa, a lot of second gen spaces value decolonizing our practices and learning about pre-colonial Philippine society. But when I talk to my mom about white supremacy or colonial mentality, she says that's not her experience or minimizes those ideas. Any tips for having healthy intergenerational conversations with respect and love? Oof. Melissa. How many days we got? Weeks. So I think one thing I had to realize, and I'm gonna give an adjacent example that kind of may shed light on this. So when I first came out as gay, I often talked about the experience of being gay in a very American point of view, the importance of coming out, the importance of being open about being gay, and obviously like my parents' understanding of queerness was shaped by growing up in the Philippines and knowing that gay means something very different there. So I used to think that like talking explicitly and trying to explain like why it's important to come out or whatever, that didn't really get me very far. But when I found ways to have my parents bear witness to gay stories without calling them gay stories, so in other words, inviting my friends over to the house and them sitting at the dining table, and whether they're Filipino or not, we're all eating like tapsilog Sunday morning after we all go out drinking on Saturday, or in other words, like the small building blocks first. I realized that those small building blocks where folks are able to exchange words and sort of share stories about each other, that was necessary before I could jump into the like into the discourse. So if I were to give an example, for example, I have a cousin who's very much connected to like pre-colonial artwork and indigenous cultures in the Philippines, not in like a exploitative way, in a way that's like partnering with them. It's not like she can go to my parents or her mom and say like, oh, we should reject European influence. Like that wouldn't work. But if she can just sort of like talk about stories of the beauty of indigenous cultures and just the sustainability of it, the like cultural exchange aspects, the empowerment aspects, I feel like that has gotten both my parents and her mom more appreciation for pre-colonial Philippine society. I think the thing is there's going to be a lot of Filipino parents that'll have like a knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, white supremacy doesn't affect us, that's more like the Black community's problem or something, right? It's hard, and I think it takes many conversations across different points in time. But if there's anything I've learned from the year 2020 to now, it's that regular engagement with like this like race discourse on race and racism, it's like a language. So the more you do it and the more you see it resonating, the more, I think the more it gets ingrained. So for example, like my parents, just if I were to rewind 3 years ago, if I said anything about the police, they would be like, how your cousin's a police officer, don't say any, like, what do you, or a priest, like, how dare you speak that way about the priest? Like they would just have this visceral reaction. And so I've had to be more subtle, and I've had to have them in situations where we gently come at the topic. To be concrete, let's take the police example, and I'll say things, we'll see something on the news that's terrible, and then let's say like my dad automatically like apologizes or tries to find a rationale. That's the point where I kind of interject with facts or something to try to interrupt it, even if I don't get him on my side per se. Like I need to interrupt it. So same thing with parents say things about like, oh, lighter skin, like don't get dark, or like we all have a ability to interrupt so that it becomes, at least they become aware of these things as well. But yeah, it's tough. I love how you emphasize the power of our stories to create a sense of belonging on campus, and address isms. You have tips for encouraging students to share their stories, lessons learned. Thank you for this. Thank you. So I teach sociology, and what's interesting is that all my students are students of color, first gen, a lot of women of color from immigrant backgrounds, either they're immigrants themselves or they're children of immigrants. I recently stopped assigning sociology texts and I started assigning personal essays. So there's a website called Catapult that a lot of women of color writers, and so instead of like I talk about sociological themes conversationally, when it comes to the reading, I have them read a lot of writing by women of color, and I cannot emphasize enough how transformative it is when I've assigned work by a woman of color. But before they have the assignment, I also show them a video and I provide a bio of the author, because all of a sudden they like look at the author and they're like, oh shoot, we're the same, and they wrote this thing. So they're much more attached emotionally to the piece without even like long before reading this first sentence. And then I asked them like, what's your version of this story? Like, do you have, one thing that really gets them going is like I asked them to pick out, I teach an immigration class, and I say like, I want you to pick one line from the text, just one quote, and that resonates with you, and then write a paragraph or two about why this quote resonates and resonates with you and your experience. And I have been floored by how much that simple question and simple exercise has gotten students to really like get more comfortable sharing their story in the context of a classroom. So yeah, in case you're wondering, if this website, it's been magical for my class. Not to be cliche, but all right, let's see. I know we have a lot of questions here. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Given the legacy of colonialism and shared religious affinities between Latinx and Filipinx, what possibilities do you see for fostering pan-ethnic solidarity among Asian Americans? I think it's happening right now. One of the silver lining, I don't even want to call it that. One of the outgrowths of everything that you see with this like Asian hate incidents, hate crimes, is that I think more than the past couple years, Filipinos have a sense of Asian American identity that's driven by like being targeted by anti-Asian sentiments. So I think that in the same way I was mentioning sharing stories is helpful. I think sharing stories of their racialized experience is also helpful. I spent a lot of time in this presentation talking about Filipino Latino connections because I feel like that doesn't get talked about as much. And so I think the same thing can be duplicated for Filipino Asian American connections. There's obviously a lot of overlap between Filipinos and other Asian groups, and so creating spaces where they can see those. And actually, the response I had earlier about the personal essays, I have my students, for example, read "Crying in H Mart" by Michelle Zauner, which is about a young woman who loses her mom, who's Korean, and she's Korean and white. So like it feels like in losing her mom, she loses her connection to Koreanness, and so she ends up like making Korean food to feel more in touch. And so Filipinos often can relate to the idea that like we don't have much access to our culture, but like food is our first point of entry to feel like we're authentically Filipino. So yeah, I think there's, in the same way personal essays can get folks to share their stories, I think it also helps folks see like what the common humanity experiences are between themselves and other Asians. I love these questions, by the way. I agree. Let's see. All right. Okay, in your study Sabrina, thank you for asking this. In your study, did anyone share an affinity with the Pacific Islander identity or find their Filipino identity as one that is Pacific Islander? Informally, this comes up in conversations with other Filipino relatives and friends. Okay, yes. What I found was that there were, for example, in the city of Carson, where I did a lot of my interviews, there was a lot of Filipinos I spoke to that would do some sort of like Pacific Islander dance or Polynesian dance. And I wondered how to think about that, because there were moments where folks talk about it in a way where it was almost like, oh, I like doing this because it's exotic, or it was almost cultural appropriation-y. But then at the same time, those were spaces where they got to be with other Filipinos and do something, cultural and fun. So it was a little bit of like I had mixed feelings about it. But in my research, what I found is that a lot of Filipinos, when given the form, asked, what do you pick, Asian or Pacific Islander? As many picked Pacific Islander as picked Asian. And then when I asked them like why, the answers were very surface level. They would say things like, well, the Philippines are islands in the Pacific, or Pacific Islander sounds cooler, or it's more exotic than Asian. Or they would say like, I don't really vibe with the Asian box, so I'm just gonna pick Pacific Islander as like a act of resistance. I think the danger with that is, of course, that folks who are from Samoa or Guam or Fiji or Tonga, people who are Pacific Islanders, they have a very unique set of racial experiences and experience with the racism that I think are different from Filipinos. And so there's part of me that also understands that, Filipinos just picking it as like an out that's not always a good thing, because for Tongans and Samoans, it's actually really, it has a different meaning for them to identify a specific island. So I often push back a little bit whenever I have Filipinos that say like I'm Pacific Islander, because there's so many like other implications to that identity beyond, you know, being islands in the Pacific. Oh my gosh, conversations with parents are very hard. Yes. Tell me about it. Me and my cousins, we like constantly trying to talk to our parents about like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and I wish all of my aunts and uncles were receptive, but it's hard. Thank you for your talk. I believe I saw a statistic on your Instagram a few years ago about there being less than 30 tenured Filipino American professors in the US. That's I think that's the research of Kevin Nadal. I just got this wonderful collection. Kevin Nadal has written a lot about Filipinos in academia, actually in this collection as well. The other students, Filipino Americans, Education and Power. Kevin and his colleague, I believe it's Dina Maramba, I'm not sure, but they talk about the number of tenured Filipino professors in the US. So it's not a lot. As someone in a postdoc position, what advice tips would you give new Filipino PhDs who are considering tenure track positions? Oh my, Stephanie. The community that you need to do the work that you want to do will not be found in your discipline or your department. And so you need to create it elsewhere. That's what I would say. If I were to have relied on sociologists or like my home department to do Filipino American or even queer work, it wouldn't happen. So you got to like manufacture your own intellectual communities because they don't exist. So that's what I would say. The good news is about there being so few Filipino Americans is that every Filipino American scholar I know is always going above and beyond to like provide their advice or resources, knowledge about how to do it. But Stephanie, if you want to connect offline in a few weeks, you know, I could give you more discipline specific advice. Because if you were like sociology or history, I can tell you one thing, but if you were like, say, in economics or political science, those are like super white. I mean, academia is racist, but like econ and poli-sci are like super racist. So like, I'll have to give you different advice for that. But yeah, I mean, you know, hit me up. I'm easy to find. Just anthony.ocampo@gmail. Oh my gosh, they really have a book called Sobbing in Seafood City. That I thought people just said that. There's an actual book. Wow. Okay. Thank you for that recommendation. Oh, nutrition. Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay. So thank you for sharing that you're a nutrition. Here's what I would say, Stephanie. In every field, there's always been someone that's been like one of the firsts or the firsts. And oftentimes I look at the way that they've been able to establish themselves as scholars. And for you, this might be a matter of like getting some research projects published in Journal of Asian American Studies or like some journal that has to do with like race and nutrition. And that might be where you kind of start building a reputation. If I were to compare this to like television, there's not going to be when it comes to creators of color and TV shows about people of color, NBC and ABC and CBS, and they're not going to pay any mind to TV shows about people of color. So what have people of color done? They have created YouTube shows, or they have, you know, done local plays or local theater. They do stand-up, and they get so good in their niche world that at some point mainstream worlds start paying attention. So I think that like any place you can do to clock your hours to establish yourself as a scholar of let's say Filipino Americanness and Filipino American nutrition. It might be in food journals, it might be in food pubs, it might be through interdisciplinary fields, but keep doing it. And over time, you'll be the person that's known for this, and then the world will catch up with you. I kind of feel like that's what happened with me, is that like I was kind of doing my own thing, and academia and sociology didn't really give a crap, and then I just got really good at doing what I do, and then they came around. Any other questions? And feel free to unmute too. I don't mind. I would love to hear other voices here.
Thank you so much, Anthony. You know, we're at time too, so I know some folks have started to travel on. I really wish we could keep this discussion going and the Q&A going, and really, again, please help me thank Dr. Ocampo and Raul and the team for being here with us. We'll put your email in the chat. I didn't catch it. I mean, I heard you say at Gmail, but we'll put your contact in the chat so people can follow up and reach out to you. You can follow him on Twitter as well. Follow Dr. Ocampo on, right, all of the social medias, the Twitter handle, IG handle, etc., wherever you want to be found. We really appreciate you. And I'm going to hand it back to Raul. Thank you, everyone, again, for staying with us and engaging in the discussion and the presentation. Very inspiring and motivating.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ocampo. Salamat for coming in today, and thank you so much for everyone that's coming today. I think Julie, do you have a question, Julie? Or
I just wanted to say that I enjoyed hearing Dr. Ocampo speak so much. I'm so glad you brought him. Thank you so much. It was truly a joy and inspiration to hear him speak. And I don't say those things lightly, but I'm so glad I tuned in and had the opportunity to hear him speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully we could have him back sometime, talk about his other book, right? Sometime soon. So maybe in person next time as well. So thank you so much. Maraming salamat, and thank you for all the ones that made this possible. Sabrina, Dr. Oliveros, we have Andrea and Leslie as well. So thank you so much, and we hope that y'all have a great the rest of the afternoon. And we'll see you soon. And thank you for celebrating Filipino American History Month with us.